Well, the wonderful folks over on Patreon voted on wanting a comparison of what they termed the treaty-ish ships, which was essentially a slightly politer way of asking, which is better, Littorio or Bismarck? So today, let's have a look at the two European Axis fast battleships and see where each one stands relative to the other. Now, normally, if you want to do a really quick comparison, you'd look at the very basics of speed, protection, and firepower, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into each of those sections and look at what contributes to each of those areas. Now, obviously, this isn't a fully comprehensive dive into the exact minutiae of every single detail on both classes of ship. Things like damage control pump numbers, interlinking capacity, slight weaknesses in the lower section of a torpedo defense system and the like. But, on the other hand, the broader capabilities are pretty much likely to inform how much such smaller details are going to end up being needed or actually mattering. And ultimately, if you wanted to go into every single detail of every single slight design flaw or design advantage compared to the average treaty battleship of the era, well, that level of detail would be a book in and of itself. And in fact, well, if you look in the video description, there are literally books about these two classes of ships that go into extreme detail about every single element of every single system. But just a few quick things before we start. Firstly, of course, yes, the Littorio class and the Bismarck class were designed for slightly different missions. They're both big, fast battleships, but what they were expected to do, and therefore the design choices that influenced their construction, did vary a little bit, whereas this is obviously therefore a slightly artificial what if the two faced off against each other kind of matchup. We're not doing a direct alternate history kind of thing, but we're comparing systems on both ships against a common comparison point. Secondly, displacement. As designed, Bismarck displaced just under 42,000 tons, and Tirpitz added almost 1,000 tons to that, and both ships displaced well over 50,000 tons fully loaded. The Littorios, as designed, displaced just under 41,000 tons and just over 45,000 fully loaded, while also being about 12 foot shorter and 10 foot narrower, but having about a foot more draft. So the Italian ships are overall slightly smaller, with significantly less difference between their standard and fully loaded displacements. So bear that in mind, we're not talking about two identical displacement hulls here. That does very occasionally have a small influencing factor on some of the decisions made. And lastly, thanks and big shout out to Italian military archives for going over the comparison that I'd written up and making some comments on the Littorio side of things, because, unsurprisingly, he knows a fair bit about them. So, with that said, let's look first at speed and all the things that are associated with that. So we'll start off with, quite literally, how fast were they? Now, here is probably the category where the two types are the closest matched on paper, as both classes were designed for a top speed of about 30 knots. The Littorios did this with just over 128,000 shaft horsepower, at least on paper, while Bismarck used just over 148,000 shaft horsepower, and Tirpitz added a little bit more than 12,000 to that. Now, all ships, Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, Bismarck and Tirpitz, and probably Roma, although I couldn't find data for her trials, seem to have exceeded their target speed on trials. But the Bismarcks only just about managed that, edging a little bit over 30 knots, while the Littorios actually cleared 31 knots quite comfortably, albeit in Italian practice they did do this run somewhat lightly loaded. So you might conclude that this would be a draw, since in-service speed would be roughly similar. But the Littorios needed roughly 3.12 horsepower per ton, if you're looking at the standard displacement, to achieve their design speed, not counting the additional horsepower they were able to generate for going over 31 knots. And similarly, if you look at their design speed versus their design power output, the two German ships needed 3.52 and 3.72 horsepower per ton respectively, making the Italian ships somewhat more efficient. So, first point goes to the Italians. Range. Now, range is a very complex matter for large warships, as you first have the amount of fuel that's stored in regular tanks, then additional fuel that could be carried at an absolute push, which some ships have provision for to varying degrees, and then you have how fast that fuel is used when the ship's travelling at different speeds, as different navies have different cruising speeds and thus fuel consumption rates. So getting a straight comparison between ships can be quite difficult. However, in this case the comparison isn't actually that hard. Although the Littorios carried more fuel by default, the Bismarcks had capacity for much, much more in auxiliary storage, and this meant that fully loaded at 19 knots, the German ships could sail almost twice as far as the Italian ships could go at 16 knots, with the latter achieving just over 4,500 nautical miles range. While the difference is understandable, since of course the Littorios were meant for Mediterranean operations and not long voyages out into the Atlantic, the simple fact is the capability gap is absolutely huge, so it's a definite point here to the Germans. That brings us to machinery layout. Now, the layout of machinery is actually quite important for a ship's survivability under fire. In this case, the two ships are quite different. The German ships use a 3-shaft system while the Italians use 4. The German ships use 12 boilers and 6 boiler rooms amidships, separated in 2 groups of 3, separated by some of the secondary magazines. After this are a pair of turbine rooms for the outer shafts, and then more secondary magazines and the bomb magazine for the ship's aircraft, with the central shaft's turbines located behind these, and are bracketed on either side by even more magazines holding propellant. The Italians, meanwhile, powered their turbines from 8 boilers set into 4 boiler rooms, set one after the other amidships. The 4 turbines were each in their own compartment, but one pair was after the boilers, the other pair was actually forward of them, and there were no magazines scattered between or around them. Now, there are pluses and minuses to each approach. The Italian system is not quite a unit system, but the turbines are separated enough and the boilers spread out enough along the length of the ship that while a single hit by a shell or a torpedo that got through the defences might knock some of them out, it's pretty much impossible to fully knock out a Littorio's primary propulsion machinery with a single hit amidships. It's also not possible to start a magazine fire in the middle of the machinery spaces, which I consider a definite plus. Conversely, the Italian boiler rooms run all the way across the ship, whereas the German boiler rooms are divided into port, middle and starboard. Now, against a blow that just breaks through the ship's protection, that might actually preserve the other compartments at the cost of a somewhat greater list, since flooding would be confined to one side, which may then require counter-flooding, whereas the Italian system distributes the flooding evenly, but the volume is larger and therefore more water could access the ship. Both ships would lose 2 boilers in the event of a single compartment being breached, but ultimately it is theoretically possible for fragments to punch through the bulkheads that separate the German boiler rooms, say if a torpedo managed to break through the torpedo defence system, and more general damage in one area of the ship is more likely to affect most or all of one of the machinery types, thus making it more likely for Bismarck to lose most or all of its propulsion power from a single hit as compared to a Littorio. The less said about packing tons of propellant in around the machinery, the better. Therefore, this point goes to the Italians. That brings us to the propeller and rudder setup. Now, as mentioned, the Germans use a 3-propeller system, ostensibly for maximum weight efficiency, along with a pair of rudders that are positioned after the outer shafts. The Italians use a 4-shaft system with 3 rudders, a main rudder amidships, and 2 auxiliary rudders, port and starboard, a considerable distance forward, with each one being situated just aft of the outer propeller shafts. Now, overall, judging this is actually pretty easy. The 3-shaft system made for a notable weakness in the ship's stern that plagued multiple German ships that were built in this manner, causing stern collapses, either partially or in whole, in a number of German ships that took damage in this area. It's notable that on Bismarck's wreck, Exactly this has happened. In fact, the stern is the only major part of her hull to suffer complete collapse under its own weight as a result of battle damage. Additionally, although steering via just propellers is always going to be extremely dicey at best, the German system rendered such attempts impossible, while the Italian system made it, at least theoretically, possible to influence the ship's course using just the propellers. However, a much larger and more important issue is the rudders. During testing, even before she left port on her final voyage, it was found that Bismarck could not reliably be steered on a consistent course without both her rudders operational, with some reports even indicating that with just one of the rudders not responding to commands and just set at 0 degrees, this resulted in enough of a loss of steering authority for the ship to wander, even if the other rudder was actually entirely working. And of course, in practice, when one of those rudders became jammed while in a turn, that was pretty much it as far as steering Bismarck in any single direction was concerned. Conversely, the Littorio's rudders were not only far enough apart that taking out one was extremely unlikely to damage either of the others, but it was established in testing that the loss or jamming of one rudder could be compensated for by the action of the other two. And less than 2 months before Bismarck was torpedoed, the Vittorio Veneto was also hit in the stern by a British torpedo bomber. But in her case, the port side backup rudder was jammed. And once she got back underway, she was able to stay on course under the authority of the main and starboard auxiliary rudders. Therefore, this one is also a point to the Italians. And so, coming out of the speed-machinery round, the Littorios are leading 3-1. Although, I suppose you could make an argument, perhaps, for the margin within the speed department to be so close as for it to be a draw, which would either make the score 3-2 or 2-1, depending on if you make a draw 1 point each or no points each. So we move on to protection. Let's start with the main belt armour. Now, speaking purely in terms of effective belt thickness, since we'll come on to various special measures and effects that both ship classes had associated with their armour later, the Bismarcks had a 12.6-inch thick maximum belt thickness, all of this translated from metric, because, well, imperial is what's usually cited with these things, at least in the English language sources. The Littorio's main belt was 11 inches thick, deliberately angled at about 12 degrees on average, and this gave almost the same effective thickness at typical battle ranges as the German belt. Plus, of course, there was another 3 inches of plate outside of this, with some concrete in between. In terms of simple effective thickness for everything that was counted as belt protection, without accounting for any other specialist factors, this puts the Italian scheme above the German. There's just more steel in the way, and concrete, as it turns out. But on the other hand, German armour steel, along with British, was materially superior in the Second World War thanks to interwar metallurgical advances. That makes German belt effective thickness slightly greater when you compare it to most other nations' steel. On the mutant third hand, though, the Italians had a better idea of the depth for the face-hardened layer on the main belt element. And if you're a gene stealer or you happen to be the Pokemon Machamp, then you can consider on the fourth hand that the German system is less subject to degradation from non-battleship scale shell hits. And so I think overall, in terms purely, as we said, of effective belt thickness, this one's about as close to a true draw as you're going to get, so I'm going to give a point to both sides. We move on to deck armour. Again, looking at the area of maximum protection. The Bismarcks have a 2-inch thick, what we would probably term a bomb deck, with between 3.9 to 4.7 inches of regular deck armour below over the vital machinery and magazine spaces. Thickness varies depending on whether it's over the magazines or the machinery, and also whether it's on the flat, the sloped part of the deck. The Littorios have a 1.4-inch thick bomb deck. For reference, a bomb deck is essentially shorthand for a high-mounted, relatively thin armour deck that's designed to defeat high-explosive bombs and at least trigger the fusing on semi-armour-piercing and armour-piercing bombs. And very possibly has some effect on very high-angle shells at very long range if you're unlucky enough to be hit by one. Main deck armour on the Littorios varies from 3.5 inches to 5.9 inches over the vitals. However, in this case, I think I have to give this one to the Italians. Both ships' bomb decks are good enough for their main purpose, even if the German one is fractionally thicker, but the Italian ships simply have more armour over their core vitals, and where it is slightly thinner, on the outer edges, on either side of the ship, there's an additional 1-inch angled plate that serves to catch splinters, fragments, and blast below it. This area is on both designs also an indirect path to the vitals as compared to the main thickness that's more amidships, so point to Italy there. That brings us on to turrets. Now, this one is actually really close. I was initially going to make this one another draw, but you'll see where I'm going with it as we move along. The Italian main battery turret roofs are about 8 inches thick forward and 6 inches thick towards the rear, compared to 7 inches and 5 inches for the German. However, the Italian main roof plate does slope down towards the front slightly, whereas the German one is flat. This means that the German plate, although fractionally thinner, has slightly more effective resistance to incoming shells. It's a similar story on the turret faces. The Italian face armour is about 15 inches thick compared to about 14 inches for the German, but, again, the German face is, in this case, closer to vertical, while the Italian is sloped back slightly more, which gives the German turret slightly better effective resistance to shells that are likely to strike it at normal battle ranges. But the German turrets do have quite a significant sloped face that joins the faceplate proper to the roof. Now, this is heavily angled, but in such a way as to provide an almost perfect perpendicular striking face to long-range shell fire. Now, against some kinds of very short-range fire, it might serve to deflect incoming shells a little bit better than a sheer vertical or near vertical element. While I might otherwise have called it a draw, as mentioned, this last factor, that angled plate with the possibility of battle range shells hitting near perpendicular, makes me give the point, albeit only just, to the Italians. And now we talk about overall armour layout. The Bismarcks use an armour layout system that is highly similar to the distributed armour system used by pretty much any navy prior to World War I and most navies during it. The Italian approach is much more along the all or nothing method, and this does show quite significantly. The Littorios devoted around 32% of their overall, and bear in mind lesser, weight to armour, and they managed to achieve, as you've probably seen thus far, comparable, or in some cases thicker, levels of protection over the various vitals when considered against the Bismarcks, which not only displace more, but use about 40% of that overall displacement for protection. Thus, while the German ships are somewhat better protected against general small caliber gunfire from destroyers and light cruisers at their extremities, in the realms of defending against peer opponents, the Italians are definitely doing more with less, so they're getting the point there. And that brings us over to the torpedo defense system. In common with the general theme here on protection, it's quite complicated. Neither ship uses the more common torpedo defense system of the period, which is multiple layers of liquid and void, or void and liquid depending on national preference, to disperse the blast of a torpedo and catch fragments. In Bismarck's case, there's one really big void, followed by a series of liquid-filled compartments ahead of the torpedo bulkhead, at least for most of the system. Now, ostensibly, this is designed to resist a 250 kilo or 550 pound explosive warhead, using TNT as a baseline. Although some have rated the system as good against about 300 kilos or 660 pounds of explosive. The Italians, on the other hand, use the tube-based Pugliese system, and that was rated against 350 kilos or 770 pounds of explosives. Surprisingly, though, against 18-inch torpedoes, i.e. mostly airdrop torpedoes, these differences in rated resistance make very little difference to in-combat effectiveness, as the lowest figures suggested for the German system would admittedly be marginally vulnerable to certain early models of Japanese Type 91 airdrop torpedo, whereas the higher-end figures and the Italian figures aren't. But outside of that, the only torpedoes that sit in the middle of this range of resistances are the German F-5B Heavy, which was a frankly terrible torpedo in any case, and the Japanese Type 91 Mod 4, which can on paper beat both Bismarck's ratings, but not the Littorio's. The British Mark 15 and Mark 17 airdrop torpedoes and the American Mark 13, all equipped with Torpex warheads, can on paper overcome any of the systems, as can the Type 91 Mod 7. Now, submarine and surface launch torpedoes are a somewhat different matter, though. There's about 24 different torpedoes which can overcome the lower-end German figures, and a dozen of those can also beat their higher-end figures, while none of those can, again on paper, break through the Italian system. So, is this an easy point for the Italians? Well, perhaps not. There were some rather major drawbacks to the Italian system. It took up a vast amount of hull volume, it had to be precision engineered, as small faults in its construction could compromise its effectiveness almost entirely, and its effectiveness dropped far more dramatically as it got thinner towards the ends of the ship compared to a more traditional liquid on void system, which Bismarck's system is in the spirit of. Also, the Littorio's system prevented the extension of the belt armour further down in the ship to counter diving shells, although at the same time its sheer size might mean it would catch the projectile instead. Also, the Pugliese system was much harder to replace once it was hit, and it was compromised over a wider area against a similar blast compared to the Bismarck system, and you couldn't really restore any of that resistance to any great degree with damage control efforts at sea, which is particularly of note if you're going to come under attack from multiple small airdropped torpedoes. Whereas Bismarck systems, if compromised, are compromised over a smaller area, and it is possible to restore at least some of the resistance with damage control efforts. Thus, although on paper the Italian system can stop a bigger torpedo, particularly if it's being shot at by submarine or surface-launched weapons, in terms of reliability, ease of maintenance, and repair, as well as the effect on other parts of the protection system and overall internal volume, I'm actually going to give this one to the Germans. Now, that's not to say the Italian system is bad, as long as it's properly made, but a Bismarck class that gets torpedoed and makes it home, assuming that's the only damage, is going to be back in action much faster than a Littorio, which is quite important when your battle fleet is otherwise outnumbered and you need as many ships as possible on the front lines. And ultimately for both classes, as well as for most battleships in the Second World War, it was the aerial torpedoes that they really had to worry about. Now, as the final part of the protection subcategory, we come to a bit which I've just labelled the special category. Now, this is where we can cover a few of the more esoteric elements of both ships' protective systems, which I'm sure people have been screaming about at the screen up to that point. So, firstly, we'll cover the Italian decapping system. Now, if this worked as intended, it would be a major point to the Italians' benefit. However, there are two big red flags to present. Firstly, it isn't entirely clear, at least to me, if it would have actually worked as intended. Now, I've done an entire video on that already, you can go and have a look at that. But even if we are generous and we assume that it does in fact work as the Italians intended it to do, the entire setup was based on the idea of being attacked by a 15-inch shell. In a world where the three big navies already had a number of ships that were armed with 16-inch guns. And as you'll hopefully recall from that video, shell size and decapping distance are directly related. Conversely, the German system simply presents a big lump of face-hardened steel and doesn't especially care about what size of shell you happen to be. So, really, that could go either way. It all hinges on if the Italian system works as intended. Now, if it does, then especially in a direct matchup of the Littorios against the Bismarcks, the Littorios would have significant protection advantages against the Bismarcks, because the Bismarcks are firing a 15-inch shell. But if it doesn't, then the inverse applies. Next, we come on to the turtleback, the Bismarck's key feature, according to some people, much beloved of Bismarck fans everywhere. Now, although there's an oft-repeated claim that Bismarck's armour is just the Bayern's armour warmed over by Bismarck detractors, that's also not actually true. Bayern actually has thicker armour on its belt, but leaving that aside, there are some other differences. Bismarck's armour deck sits a little bit higher relative to the waterline, and the deck armour is just a little bit thicker as well, and that's just naming two changes. However, the general principle is the same. The idea being that if a shell penetrates the main belt and is therefore on its way to the vitals, the angled sides of the turtleback, a term which dates all the way back to the era of the protected cruiser, will be able to resist or reject the at least slowed and ideally somewhat damaged incoming shell. Now, this is held by some to provide as good or better protection compared to simply upping the thickness or the angle, or both, of the main belt. There are, however, some problems with this. The greater area that the deck armour covers, plus the overall distributed nature of Bismarck's armour scheme, means that the absolute deck thickness is less than found on many lighter displacement period battleships. This opens up a number of potential scenarios where the turtleback could be a detriment. Firstly, at long range, there is a chance of a hit punching through the upper belt, which is just under 6 inches thick, and then coming down at a near perpendicular angle on the sloping side of the turtleback, which actually makes penetration fairly likely. Shells coming in at a shallow angle, but still passing through the upper belt, could also simply hit the flat part of the deck, which is, again, thinner than most, and therefore might punch through. Even in an ideal environment where the shell is hitting the main armour belt first, the thinner nature of this armour compared to other period battleships means, firstly, penetration of that main armour belt is more likely to occur in the first place, which could rather more immediately lead to flooding, regardless of what happens with the armour deck. And when that shell comes through, there's probably going to be a considerable amount of power behind it, especially when the ship is fighting at closer ranges or against bigger guns. And so it's possible that large fragments of the belt armour punched out and going ahead of the shell itself might strike and compromise the slopes of part of the turtleback prior to the shell itself arriving, at which point the relative angle of impact also makes it possible for the shell to normalise towards a more perpendicular angle and then go on to penetrate the belt, even if a strictly linear measure of theoretical effective thickness might suggest the shell should skip straight off. While some survivors from Bismarck's engineering section are famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, for claiming that everything was well when they left and the machinery was just happily ticking over, if you actually bother to look through all the available accounts, the majority of claims made by survivors from the engineering spaces actually talk of a variety of things, including flooding, fire, and leaks coming through the ceiling, i.e. the deck armour. So it would seem that some or all of what I just described in terms of potential scenarios where the deck might be compromised did actually occur, despite the on-paper figures suggesting that the system should have remained largely unbreached. And that brings us up to the other major issue with Bismarck's armour layout, the free surface effect coupled with reserve buoyancy. Now, although not all capital ships follow the trend of reserve buoyancy, the general design trend in the dreadnought period was for volume described by the ship's citadel, i.e. the volume under the main armour deck and behind the main armour belt and the armoured bulkheads that cap it either end, but not including the torpedo defence system, and making some allowance for the volume occupied by machinery and the structural weight of all of that, plus the ship itself. That remaining volume, and therefore potential displacement of water, should be greater than the amount that the ship typically displaces to stay afloat in normal conditions. Because this means that even if every unprotected or partially protected portion of the ship is riddled and flooded, the ship in theory will stay afloat. And that in turn would allow for the ship to remain at least partially in combat, assuming some of its armament is still functional, and at the very least it can continue to resist incoming shells, which might distract from other ships. And if it's still intact, if the battle is won, or at least the enemy withdraws, you might even be able to salvage the vessel. Now, as mentioned, not every Dreadnought-era capital ship follows this rule, one that was established all the way back by the ironclad HMS Warrior, but the majority do. This is sometimes referred to as reserve buoyancy, although that term can, somewhat confusingly, also be used to describe the fully enclosed volume of the ship in a few other circumstances, such as once the ship is fully sealed up at action stations. In that case, it can describe essentially how much weight you need to add to get the main deck awash, which is generally when you start to have uncontrollable leaks. For example, the total reserve buoyancy of USS New Jersey, in an undamaged condition, is actually, ironically enough, about the same as the total mass of USS Texas, basically meaning that if you took the entirety of USS Texas and somehow balanced it on top of the New Jersey, then you just about have New Jersey's deck just about coming awash. But obviously the reserve buoyancy of the Citadel is less than this. Now, in any case, the relatively low-mounted nature of Bismarck's armour deck means that not only does she miss this margin of the Citadel being buoyant enough to hold the rest of the ship up, but it actually misses it by quite a long way. You can, in theory, sink Bismarck without ever penetrating the Citadel. Just riddle the bow and the stern, and she'll become negatively buoyant anyway. Now, here again, the low armour deck doesn't help, as she doesn't need to settle all that much for a considerable amount of water to start flowing over the Citadel, trapping anyone inside, and this leads to another problem related to this flooding above the deck, the free surface effect. In simple terms, if water gets into an otherwise mostly enclosed container, any movement can send that water cascading across the container, and then both the inertia of it running up against the side and the weight of it all piling up on that side exacerbate any list that is caused. Now, the problem with Bismarck's armour deck is twofold here. Not only does it let water flood over the top of it with relatively minimal overall flooding compared to most period battleships, which would lead to free surface effect problems occurring fairly quickly, but the turtleback also gives a natural channel for the water to collect in right on the edge of the ship, and so any significant roll could see hundreds or even thousands of tons of water cascade to one side of the ship, assuming the bulkheads are compromised, which, let's face it, if she's riddled that much, they probably are. And then that water is going to gather in a fairly deep area right on that side, pretty much as far from the centre of balance of the ship as it's really possible to be. And that, in turn, is going to make the ship very unstable and develop an exaggerated list fairly quickly. The additional effect of that water could even theoretically pull the ship over on that side to a point where other shell holes, perhaps in the upper belt, which normally would be well above the water, are now submerged and thus admit more water to that side of the ship as they're dragged down, and it could even cause the ship to list so much that water overwhelms the main decks and then starts pouring down all the hatchways, and then the ship capsizes. And free surface effect capsize has claimed a number of ships over the years. Therefore, once you look into these special features of the two ships in a bit more detail, the issues with the overall design of the German ship's protection run into considerably more potential vulnerabilities than that faced by the Italians. So, in this case, I'm going to give the Italians another point. So the protection round goes to the Italians 5 points to 2. At which point, unless you're giving the speed a score draw, the overall score is 8 points to 3 in favour of the Littorios. But there's a lot of points to play for in the next category, firepower. So let's go with the main guns. Both parties have 15-inch guns. Littorio has one additional gun, with 9 guns in 3 triple turrets versus Bismarck's 8 guns in 4 twins. The Littorios also have somewhat better overall arcs of fire, If we compare the shells, though, the Littorio class uses slightly heavier shells, although interestingly, the full armour-piercing shell has a smaller bursting charge than the German armour-piercing shell, but the Italians, at least on paper, have access to a semi-armour-piercing shell that some sources mention, which has a larger bursting charge. The Italian shells, shockingly to anyone who's been paying the slightest bit of attention to Italian battleship history, travel somewhat faster. This, in theory, should give them more range and more sustained armour-piercing capability, and this certainly seems to be borne out by the statistics. If we look at the elevation figures for the guns, the German guns can hit almost 39,000 yards when elevated at 30 degrees, whereas the Italian guns are reaching about that distance at a mere 25 degrees of elevation. And at around 22,000 yards, the Italian shell is travelling about 150 feet per second faster, with a couple of degrees less angle of fall than the German shells, which makes it better for belt penetration. Likewise, if we look at the 20 to 21,000 yard bracket, the Italian shell has more penetration, around 3.5 inches more at that range if you use the US Navy formula, and around half an inch more if you use each nation's own respective tables. The reason for using the different range brackets for those various figures is simply because that's roughly where different test ranges for German and Italian guns match up. So overall, if an Italian shell hits you, you are going to feel it a lot more. And of course, the Italians are going to get an extra roll of the dice per salvo with the extra gun. Now, granted, the Italians' guns do wear out faster, and we will come on to some of the effects of that later, but when you're considering just the gun and the shell that it fires, this is a solid point to the Italians. Then we move on to the main turrets. Now, turret armour we've already covered under the protection category, but in addition to having a slightly better overall field of fire, especially when you're trying to fire at a target that's ahead of you, the Italian turrets can elevate 5 to 6 degrees more than the German, granting them additional range if for some reason you need it or you think you can actually hit at that range. Both turrets elevate at the same rate, but the Italian turret does turn fractionally faster, and the Italian ship can load its guns at a greater angle of elevation. And this actually plays in quite well with its higher velocity that we mentioned earlier. In almost all circumstances in battle, the German turret has to lower its guns after firing to reload. This extends the overall reload period, whereas the Italian turret can have its guns elevated between firing and still be reloaded at ranges of up to around 30,000 yards or 15 degrees of elevation, which basically means that in any realistic battle, the Italian guns don't have to depress in order to be reloaded. They can just stay pointed straight at the enemy. Now, there is a possible counter to the apparent Italian walkover in this category, and that is that the Littorio's rate of fire is somewhat low, indicating a salvo about every 40 to 45 seconds. And the German turret is sometimes claimed to be able to manage around every 20 seconds, which is around 3 rounds per minute. But that doesn't really hold out under closer inspection. Krupp themselves indicated a slightly slower figure of 1 salvo every 26 seconds, or 2.3 rounds per minute per gun, and that was at a fairly low elevation where the guns didn't have to spend additional time elevating and depressing between shots. Additionally, the hoists that are claimed to be capable of providing ammunition to the Bismarck's guns at such a high rate were unreliable and broke down or jammed frequently when you tried to use them at full speed. Nonetheless, even operating at a more average rate in line with most other ships, around about 1 round every 30 seconds or 2 rounds a minute, does give the Germans a higher rate of fire than the Italian turret. But when you consider that most engagements are actually fought at 1 round per minute, or a little bit slower due to the travel time of the shells, it's not quite enough to claw back those other advantages like being able to reload with your gun still pointing at the enemy. And so this point, I think at least, goes to the Italians. Then we come to secondary guns. Both classes have a split secondary battery, so we actually get to look at anti-ship and anti-air heavy guns separately. Starting with the anti-shipping guns, the German 5.9-inch and the Italian 6-inch are both present in reasonable numbers. There's 12 guns in total, 6 guns per side, with the Germans having their guns in 6 twin turrets, the Italians in 4 triples. This gives the Germans greater redundancy, as well as the ability to engage more targets with their secondary battery. Although the flip side to this is that the Italian 6-inch secondary turrets are ridiculously heavily protected for secondary guns. The faceplates are actually capable of surviving some main battleship gun rounds from battleships, as long as they're fired at somewhat longer battle ranges. The German guns can fire about 50% faster than the Italian. Although the German armor-piercing shell is fractionally lighter, the high-explosive shell is slightly heavier, and both of them carry more explosive than their Italian counterparts. With both guns able to range out far beyond any realistic effective range for their caliber, although the Italian gun does shoot a fraction faster and does hit a little harder, I think this point is definitely going in the Germans' favour, given the use case for secondary battery guns, for the most part, as the primary anti-destroyer and anti-light cruiser armament. Within realistic engagement ranges, they can simply get more shells on target and target more ships at the same time. So that brings us on to a proper consideration of the secondary turrets. Now, the turrets for the guns, as we mentioned, there's greater redundancy for the Germans, but they can also train and elevate faster, although maximum elevation is less important, as both of them, again, as mentioned before, can fire far beyond their effective engagement range. The Italian turrets, though, allow for loading at up to 20 degrees of elevation, which would allow them to claw back some rate of fire and target tracking over the German guns, because those need to come back down almost level to reload. However, again, bearing in mind the main use case of secondary guns as anti-destroyer weapons, I'm going to just about give this point to the Germans, as their turrets are just in a better position to track small, fast-moving targets at close ranges. Now, although I did almost knock them for placement, as of course, as we mentioned in the speed category, it does lead to them having secondary battery magazines in the middle of the machinery. Then we move on to heavy anti-aircraft guns. Now, in heavy anti-aircraft gun terms, the Germans show up to the party with 16 105mm guns in 8 twin mounts, giving them an 8-gun broadside, while the Italians have a dozen 90mm guns in single mounts with a 6-gun broadside. Both mountings do have issues breaking down at sea when they get wet, which isn't really great, so there's no real benefit or loss in comparison in that term. The German rounds are somewhat heavier, which you'd expect from a gun that's 15mm larger, and in a rather rare circumstance, it's the German gun that has the higher muzzle velocity, which also actually goes with a higher rate of fire, if only just. Now, this obviously gives them a greater range and anti-aircraft ceiling than the Italian guns, and although in and of itself the maximum figures are a little bit meaningless because you're never going to actually hit an aircraft out there by anything other than sheer blind luck, why they do matter is that the German anti-aircraft shell is likely to reach a somewhat more realistically ranged target much more quickly, and thus you need to lead the target less, which simplifies your fire control solution. The German guns also elevate and train a little bit better, thanks to having some power-assisted operation, and all of this combines with just having more guns, which you can bring to bear, to give the heavy anti-aircraft point to the Germans. Although it should be noted that on Bismarck specifically, at the time of her maiden and, as it turned out, only voyage, some genius had stuck 2 different kinds of gun mounting on her with 2 different performance rates, which might help to partially explain the gun's rather abysmal performance against the Swordfish. Now, going down to medium anti-aircraft guns. Well, this flips everything around. The Italians have 20 37mm guns, at least as originally constructed. The Germans have 16, but outside of any other details, the Italian guns are automatic weapons with 6-round magazines that can, to a certain degree, be chain-fed, a bit like the 40mm Bofors. The German 37mm, on the other hand, is the single worst medium anti-aircraft gun of the war. It's the utterly abysmal 37mm SKC-30. Yeah, the single-shot hand-loaded one. At which point the fact there's only 16 of them might actually be counted as a good thing, as it means there are less men wasted crewing a system that's barely adequate for letting other anti-aircraft gun crews know that there's actual work to be done. So point to the Italians so that I can move on and not think about the C-30 any more than I actually have to. Moving on quickly and gratefully to light anti-air. For both navies, light anti-aircraft comes in the form of 20mm weapons. The Germans use a Rheinmetall gun, while the Italians is made by Breda. Now, the exact numbers deployed don't really matter that much, as the total number installed, what gun mountings they're in, and where they are on the ship varies year by year and ship by ship. When it comes to rate of fire, both guns are pretty similar in the earlier years, although some of the more advanced mountings on Tirpitz have a considerable rate of fire advantage. Likewise, all but Tirpitz's guns have a slightly lower than ideal magazine capacity and do experience some jamming issues, obviously resolved with Tirpitz's more advanced mountings, but the German gun is slightly longer range and can train in a wider arc, and thus I'm going to give this one to the Germans by a relatively decent margin. So having looked at the guns and the turrets, we can look at the fire control system. Firstly, the main fire control system. Now, looking purely at the optical rangefinders coupled to the central fire control computer, the Littorios had a truly ridiculous number of high-quality rangefinders, most of them duplex, i.e. using both coincidence and stereoscopic rangefinding, achieving a level of optical observation that would make Sauron himself envious. Both classes of ship have a mechanical fire control computer that's more than up to the task, but overall, the Italian system on paper and in reality actually appears to have been able to get range estimates correct even faster than the German one, which itself seems to have been able to return pretty good and fast results, but was far more dependent on operator skill. Also, whether you're using radar or optical input, the Italians carried on splinter and blast shielding for the communications cables to their main mast-mounted systems, i.e. the primary mast-mounted systems, not the systems mounted on the main mast, all the way up to said systems, as opposed to cutting off the armour protection a couple of decks short, which would leave it vulnerable to blast and splinters, which is what happened on Bismarck. Thus, for the traditional optical fire control system, the point goes to the Italians. Now we get to anti-aircraft fire control. This is a bit of a mixed bag. The Littorio's anti-aircraft fire control system is generally superior to Bismarck's in the case of light and medium anti-aircraft guns, simply because they have some, rather than relying on the individual mountings to work everything out for themselves. But by the latter part of the war, Tirpitz had arguably attained a superior degree of fire control for their 105mm guns compared to the Italian 90mm. But since the Italians had bowed out of the war in 1943, they weren't able to further develop their systems, so we don't know exactly how good they would have gotten. And they still had that advantage of having dedicated range and bearing stations which could transmit data for their smaller anti-aircraft guns. So I'm going to give the point to the Italians. Now, of course, radar. Well, this one's fairly easy. The Germans have radar. The Littorios, for the most part, do not. So it's a pretty easy point for the Germans there. And then finally we come to the special entry. Now, for this final entry, we're going to look at the shell issues experienced by both parties. Now, for the Italians, their infamous inability to actually ever hit anything with the Littorio's main gun batteries. Now, as I've explained elsewhere, I believe now that, based on the work that's been done by Bill Jurens and colleagues, and is readable in Warship International, this is most likely due to the overstabilization of the shells, resulting in non-optimal flight profiles for the shells on their way down. Now, while in my own estimation as an engineer, I think this is probably a transient issue, which means that with certain amounts of barrel wear, the guns could actually shoot quite accurately, and this accounts for spreads from Italian guns at times being actually pretty tight and at other times being hilariously wide. It's essentially a potluck as to whether your main battery is going to be in sniper mode or movie-style shotgun mode on any given day. Now, in theory, that is a fixable problem, but during the course of the war, no one seems to have figured out exactly what the issue was at the time, and that, of course, is not a brilliant thing if you're going into an engagement where actually hitting a target is important. The Germans, on the other hand, had far less issues with their shells consistently going where they are actually aimed, but they had far more issues than the Italians did with getting their shells to actually explode when they got there. Now, of course, Bismarck did famously land a perfectly working shell on Hood, with rather destructive results, but at the same time, in the same engagement, the shell that famously fetched up inside Prince of Wales only did so because it was a dud. And duds were a relatively common problem across large-caliber German naval artillery. But even a dud 15-inch shell still has a large amount of very hot metal coming at you at extremely high speed, so overall I judge that while that issue is also fixable, the issue is less of a problem than the one that the Italians faced. So the point here, and the last point, goes to Germany. And that means that the Germans, with the Bismarcks, take the firepower round, 5 points to the Italians, 6 points to the Germans. But it also means that overall, the Italians take this comparison as their victory by 13 points to 9, making the Littorio overall the better ship based on the larger design choices and the issues that those presented, at least without going into specific weighting in any one category, which you could argue for or against, but of course introduces a certain amount of author bias. And as we mentioned at the start, we haven't covered smaller details within the designs, or indeed other factors that you might think are quite important, like seakeeping and stability, which do lie out a little bit outside the basic triangle of statistics. And if you wanted to include those, of course, that might affect the scores a little bit. And you have to remember that 13 to 9 roughly equates to 60-40. So although the Littorio, by my estimate, is a better ship, it's not making the Bismarck a terrible one in comparison, just not quite as good. So what additional factors do you think are important enough to include in perhaps an extended analysis, which could give points either way? Would you perhaps weight some of these factors more than others, making a victory worth 1.5 points or 2 points, or a loss being a negative? Or do you perhaps disagree with some of the points that I've analysed and think maybe it should have gone Italy's way when I gave the point to Germany, or it should have gone Germany's way when I gave the point to Italy? And if so, what factors would you point out to advocate for changing that point one way or the other? Let us know in the comments below.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.